A very warm welcome to everybody here in Marseille at the IUCN World Congress live. Also a warm welcome to the people viewing on YouTube at this wonderful session organized by Commonland. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to make one announcement, which is that we will stop at 3 o'clock sharp because Willem Verweda has to catch a plane or catch a train actually, and a cab, sorry. Anyway, he has to leave, so we will stop at 3 o'clock. But until then, almost an hour, we're here, everything about the wonderful work of Commonland. And Commonland is a highly valued IUCN member from the Netherlands, part of the IUCN Netherlands Committee. It's a relatively young organization. You'll hear much more about it. And I'm also very proud that we can present this here in this pavilion to learn about the successes of this highly innovative concept for landscape restoration. And it's particularly a pleasure to announce the first speaker, Willem Verweda. Willem Verweda is director of Commonland. And he has founded Commonland, but before that, he has a long history in IUCN, being one of my predecessors, the former director of IUCN Netherlands Committee, but also for many, many years, a very active member of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. How this all came together into founding a new organization, Commonland, I'm sure Willem will tell us all about. We also have other experts, Jasper Bertels from Commonland, joining us through video connection from the Netherlands. I wish you all a wonderful session, and I'll get back to you after the presentations. Willem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Does everyone hear me? Okay, very good, very good. Yeah, maybe you can put up a slide. Yeah, so this presentation is about twofold. I will briefly explain about the framework we have developed for integrated landscape management or holistic landscape restoration. And then my colleague Jasper Bertels, who is in Amsterdam currently, he couldn't come over, unfortunately, he will explain further the landscape valuation, so the finance model underneath and how that is working. So let me briefly explain a bit first introduce myself. I'm a tropical ecologist and indeed have a long track record within IUCN, also within IUCN Netherlands Committee. And in 2012, I realized, that a next level is needed to restore and protect landscapes in such a way that also business models can be found out, but within an ecosystem approach. And maybe you have heard of the ecosystem approach that has been developed by IUCN and others, and that was accepted by the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2000. It is a highly theoretical, but very good framework. But my challenge was how to make it practical for farmers, investors, and people on the land, conservationists, in such a way that it gives them sufficient tools to do things, act at a large scale that is replicable, that people can compare different landscapes among themselves, and attractive for investors and governments. Combining a multi-stakeholder approach with an ecosystem approach. That was the challenge I took up. And I must say that wasn't an easy job, unfortunately, but I knew that. So next slide, please. So, or you can give me a handout. Yeah. So what we want actually is to create a kind of an intel insight for the upcoming restoration industry. You are aware of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that started this year in June. But if we don't have a kind of an intel insight, you have 1,000 landscapes with 1,000 approaches, and funders, investors, and business people, as well as governments, don't know what to do. So how to create that? And therefore we need to look into, what is really behind this. And behind this is that we need to work together, of course. We all know that, but it's not always in our ambition to work together. We all want to do our own things. The ego side, you could say, while moving to the eco side. But to realize large-scale landscape restoration, we need to work together. And therefore, you need to have a shared common vision. Next slide, please. And you need to understand how an ecosystem works. And to make it let's say, more sound how an ecosystem works, I decided to talk about landscapes or seascapes to farmers and practitioners, because it didn't make sense, you know, to use jargon and biodiversity and payment for ecosystem services and all that kind of stuff. We can talk about it here, but on the countryside, we need to find another language. And that language I decided was, and this is more or less the theory of change, is that in each degraded ecosystem or landscape, you will find 4 losses. People have lost their purpose and they'll move away, migrate to cities. People have lost their job and social security, another reason to move away. Why? Because the system has been severely degraded. Soil, biodiversity, deforestation, pollution, you name it. So that is the biodiversity loss, the nature loss. And that also has consequences for the local rural economic activities. And that's the economic loss. So you have 4 losses, and that is characterizing an ecosystem that is degraded. 4 losses. And everyone understands this. I've interviewed farmers in 2012 and investors, and everyone understands those 4 losses. So the theory of change is, if you want to go to a restored landscape, it should deliver 4 returns. And I deliberately have chosen for the word return, because farmers, investors, corporates, as well as NGOs and conservation organizations understand what a return is. And the first return, of course, is the most important one. And that is quite often forgotten about people and scientists. And that is a return of inspiration. We need to bring back hope and talk about hope and inspire people to do the right thing and work together. So the return of inspiration, and yes, you can measure that. It is not easy, but you can measure that. The second one is, of course, we need to return jobs to the countryside, not massive, monocultures with only one company that is, working on 1 million hectares of soil, palm oil, but more jobs for local people in a more diverse landscape. So the second one is we need to return the social activities, or we need to return social capital. The third one you all know is returning natural capital, biodiversity, you name it. And the third one, and the fourth one is sustainable financial capital. It should, people should earn money and should earn something, and they should have a well-being, a good life. So these are those 4 returns. Next slide, please. And to do this well, to make sure that people understand what a landscape is, that farmers and local people and local entrepreneurs and mayors and local governments understand what the size of a landscape is, we said a landscape is minimum 100,000 hectares. So it can have a lot of people who live there. And we divided it in 3 zones. Each landscape should have a good balance between an economic zone where you live, where you have cities, where you process, where you have plants and so on. A natural zone, protected areas, and those protected areas should be connected, of course, within that landscape, those mosaic landscapes. And then there is a zone that quite often has been forgotten, and that is the combined zone. The combined zone in general does not exist. Most of the combined zone now are large agricultural, monocultural, degrading land systems, quite often with badlands. Our ambition is combine agriculture with biodiversity, combine the production of food and fibers and water with the production of biodiversity. Combine those 2 elements. And then you come up with things like agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, rotational grassland management, and these kind of things. So a landscape that delivers 4 returns, you need to understand that works from a 3-zone approach. Another element, of course, is time. Time means we need to move away from project funding towards process funding and processes. Of course, we need a lot of projects, commercial projects, restoration project, conservation project, water management projects, you name them, social projects. But we need to create a process, and that process should be funded where you enable these projects to land well at the right place. And that is why we added an extra component to move away from project funding, 20 years minimum. So we want to work with a 20 minimum time frame, 20 years minimum time frame. Quite often we need more time, of course. Next slide, please. So this is how it, this is the overview, and you can find it in publications and on the web, also with videos. 20 years, and sorry, 4 returns are delivered by three zones through a process, a catalytic process of 5 process elements: create landscape partnerships, shared understanding, collaborative vision and planning, taking action and monitoring and learning during a period of minimum 20 years. This is the theory. In 2013, we decided to found Commonland with IUCN CEM and the Rotterdam School of Management and investors and some philanthropists. And we start doing it in Spain. Next slide, please. In Australia and other places. Oh yeah, this is good for you also to add. I forgot about this slide, thank you. You can of course connect those 4 returns to the SDGs. And that is important for business and governments, of course, so that they can refer to, if they work on this on landscape restoration, to, you know, they can refer to those SDGs. From a policy perspective, is it super important? Next slide. So we started to build proof of concept. We started to work in Spain, in South Africa. In Spain, we work in 1 million hectares between Granada and Murcia. We build a landscape partnership team. We have set up companies. I will say something about it. In South Africa, we started to work with a local NGO that's now become a landscape partnership, and also work with farmers and set up companies there. Same thing in Australia and India and in the Netherlands. And meanwhile, other entities, other organizations are now also going to copy this model, like TNC wants to work with it in India, the Charles Darwin Foundation in the Galapagos Islands, and we have contacts with WWF in Namibia. So more and more organizations want to use this model because they can compare landscapes, and they can use this as a kind of intel insight. There's a whole KPI system beneath it, not too difficult, because otherwise people get lost. We don't need 120 KPIs to monitor one, return, because that doesn't make sense for farmers. They need to bring the data. They need to inform us how things are going. We can't send, very expensive consultant teams to those landscapes and say, do the monitoring and evaluation. That's not how this should work. Thank you. Next slide, please. Just an example from Spain. In Spain, we started in 2014. And in 2015, the first landscape partnership was formed, first with 30 farmers. Now we have more than 350 farmers and local entrepreneurs. The size is 1 million hectares, which is, just for your information, if you know the Netherlands, it's a quarter of the Netherlands. So it's for Dutch people quite big. And we have set up companies already. And now there are a lot of actions on the ground: tree planting or removal invasives, restoring water catchments, and especially in the combined zone, turning almond plantations in a polycropping system with green cover, building, let's say, the topsoil, building the biodiversity in the soil, etc. And that whole movement is now growing faster and faster every year. We now have 4 companies and investors for those companies that produce regenerative almonds or regenerative olive oil, regenerative wine. And we are coming into this in the next stage that we are looking for off-takers. So we talked to Danone, to the IKEAs and other who would like to have those products. Next slide. To give you some impressions of green cover and how it starts. Next slide. Yeah, and some products and how the landscape look like. And here's an interesting one. You see that figure there? That is the return of inspiration. So at a certain moment, villages came to us and said, we would love to do restoration, but also with figures in the landscape, because that is about our identity. Those figures are shamans' signings that were found in caves. And people are proud of that history. And they said, we would love to put that in that landscape. And so they were thrilled to do it. And they were able to get extra funding, farmers who gave land to do it, others who gave labor force, all free. And these things are going and faster every day. So it means that the pride what we call that people start to inspire themselves and create a vision where they that gives a kind of outlook, a future outlook. And that wasn't there before. This was a countryside in crisis. People were leaving to the cities. There were no youngsters anymore. And now some young families are coming back already. Next slide. I don't know what this is. Maybe next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, and just I'm almost to give hand over the microphone to my colleague Jasper, who is going to tell more about the finance behind this. This is another example. In 2014, we started to work with Western Australian guys who were living in the wheat belt of Australia, a very degraded area, you know, 4 times, 5 times the size of the Netherlands. And that area was deforested over the last 120 years. When the British came on board, they really deforested the whole area, kicked out the Aboriginals, and they wanted to plant cereals there because it was, you know, there were not many mountains there, the rainfall was okay. But what they forgot was the soil. The soil was very old. And if you remove the tree cover at the end with rainfall, the rain will come in touch with geological places where you still have a lot of salt. And now many of the rivers there are brackish. Can you imagine? In the middle of Australia, you find marine plants alongside brackish rivers. So the system is really almost collapsing. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to start in this place, a place in crisis. And also a place where some Australian farmers were so desperate that they wanted and were open for a change. And the change here is that we started in a different way. We started with a regenerative company because that was the entry point there. So we started wide open agriculture. And that company is now the first and only listed regenerative landscape company in the world at the Australian and Frankfurt Stock Exchange since 2018. And the share quadrupled over the last 3 years. So there is a kind of movement that is positive on the commercial side on regenerative agriculture. And of course, this is still tiny. It is a startup, although it's growing very fast now. And they work on, they produce together with the farmers, regenerative cereals, regenerative meat, and they're starting to produce regenerative lupine, of course, all in a polycropping system. That important step was an important step for Aboriginals to team up with them, and the Noongar community, which is indigenous in that part of Australia, said, if you do this, we really want to we are there, you know, for more than 40,000, maybe even 60,000 years. We know how to manage this land, but now the momentum is coming that people can take us seriously after having been discriminated, of course, for, you know, since the beginning, white men came there. And they are building a movement to do the natural restoration site in this place. Next slide, please. Yes, and I think I will now hand over to my colleague Jasper Bertels. Jasper, are you there? Who will tell more about the finance and the valuation side behind this for returns framework that has now been, by the way, also adopted by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. You can find this new publication on the web, which is a kind of simple publication, but there are more things that you can find on, because the ambition is, of course, to create a scalable framework that people can use and that can be copied and that you can use as a kind of narrative and language, so you can compare with each other, you know, investors, but also landscape practitioners where they are. Jasper, up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Willem. And can you all hear me from here?
We don't hear you.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I think everyone heard you because I forgot to put on my phone. So now I'm hearing you as well. So please, you can start now.
Okay, thanks, Willem. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where you are. I'm happy to have the opportunity to give a bit of our perspective on mobilizing funding for landscape restoration, and also presenting a valuation model that we developed to overcome some of the barriers for mobilizing funding, and hopefully have a fruitful discussion on that with all of you at the end. On this slide, I wanted to start with a brief overview of some of the key barriers that we see to mobilize large-scale funding for land restoration. Over the last 7 years, as Willem explained, we have also shown that it's possible to turn 4 losses into 4 returns. And in general, there's sufficient proof that that successful landscape restoration is possible. But despite the significant potential of landscape restoration, there are some barriers that hamper mobilizing funding. And some of the key barriers that we see, I have listed below. So I walk through them briefly. The first one is focus on short-term value. So actually short-term financial returns instead of looking longer term and more broadly on value, including financial, natural, and social capital. The second one is the hidden value. And what I mean with that is actually, so when you look at, for example, financial returns from these kind of activities, some of the financial returns are a bit hidden. They're not so clear upfront because they're often realized further in the future, and also they're oftentimes indirect. So for example, they flow through natural returns, they lead to financial returns. So when you restore the landscape and you improve the soil and water and biodiversity, that will lead to more stable and better returns in the longer term. And also financial returns. Then there's another barrier, that's the still limited information for investment decisions. So what we actually need is more, let's say, quantified, substantiated returns, and then in a metric that all stakeholders can understand. Also, which is quite known, of course, is that there's still a data gap. So that means also data on what does it actually bring when you restore a landscape, when you look at the different returns. But I think that this issue or this barrier will be overcome quite soon. Just because there are many organizations already working hard to pull those data together. And also, I think from the technology side, this gap will be minimized. So then we have two others, in my view. So that's the cash flow mismatch when you do this. So what I mean here is that you need large upfront investments. It's like an investment in infrastructure where you have to build the infrastructure upfront. So that's a sort of platform for more sustainable growth in the long term. And after that, let's say the benefits will come further in the future. And the last one is the mismatch between payers and receivers of doing this. So often the stakeholders that will bear the costs are different stakeholders from the ones that receive the benefits. So for example, when farmers have regenerative practices, which leads to, for example, a higher water quality, it is everyone, it's local communities who will benefit from that, and not per se only the farmers who have to pay the cost up front. Next slide, please. So the only thing I wanted to stress here is, so we saw some of these barriers for funding mobilization, and we wanted to build something, a sort of assessment tool for the true value of landscape restoration to overcome these barriers. And based on that, we had a couple of objectives. We wanted to show the hidden value, so that's actually the long-term integrated value, including social, natural, and financial returns. And it had to be in a way that it could be understood by all different stakeholders. So for example, so we think that it's useful to do it in a monetary metric, so in euros or dollars, just because that's a metric that can be understood by farmers as well as NGOs, as well as private companies, etc. And then there were two other objectives based on the previous two. So when we are able to do that, 1 and 2, we think it's much easier to build these innovative finance mechanisms and attract large-scale funding for these restoration projects and to scale up these projects. And the other thing I wanted to stress here are what were, in our view, the key target groups for such a method. Because we wanted a method that also calculates the returns for different stakeholders in a landscape. So you can also see whether there is a mismatch between payers and receivers, and there can be a redistribution of returns and values between those stakeholders. So we saw key target groups were actually the key stakeholders around those landscapes that we generally see. So governments at different levels, also local people, local communities, including farmers, indigenous people, landowners, different types of investors, public and private, and NGOs. Next slide, please. Of course, we also looked at when we want to achieve this and overcome these barriers, are there existing methodologies and methods that we can use which fit our needs? So what we wanted to have is a landscape approach instead of, for example, a business or a value chain perspective. So that's the scope, actually, because when you take a landscape approach, it's possible to include all the different stakeholders and also the interactions between the stakeholders. It needed to have a well-balanced, integrated value perspective. And we thought it's important to calculate the monetary, let's say the quantified benefits in monetary terms, so everyone can understand. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in the end, we didn't find a method that met all our needs, and that's why we decided to build our own with our existing partners, but we didn't do it from scratch, and we didn't reinvent the wheel, but used some strong building blocks we already have. So that's integrated landscape restoration, that's the first one, and based on that, our 4 returns framework, and yeah, also leading scientific approaches from the ecological side as well as from the business side. Next slide, please. So we developed this method with our partners, and this is just to give you a short overview of some of the partners who supported the development of this. There were some NGOs which were existing partners already of us, universities, so there's Erasmus University, from the economic perspective, and Wageningen University, who brought in the ecological perspective, a pension fund, and a Dutch Ministry of Agriculture. Next slide, please. This slide is actually a very high-over snapshot of some of the key elements of the method. I also want to stress here that we'll don't go into very much detail on the method in this presentation. So I'll also refer you to the documents and the publications that we have on the method, and we'll share the links with you later on, also via our YouTube channel. So this slide is just a brief overview of the key elements. That's the integrated value, social, natural, and financial return, and very importantly, the inspiration as the engine for those other returns. It's about monetary value, but we also went beyond monetizable returns. So we didn't only look at the value of the to be realized cash flows, but as social and natural returns are often not yet monetizable or cannot yet be translated into tangible cash flows. We also thought it's important to put a monetary value in dollars or euro terms on those values. I will tell you a bit more on that later. We applied a stakeholder approach, so include the main stakeholders in those landscapes. And the last one here is that we used leading science and methods from the ecological side. So it's aligned with DEEP, for example, and also from the business side. Next slide. Yeah, this gives an overview of the proceeds side, actually, of the method that we developed. So what we wanted to do is to develop a standardized method for valuing landscape restoration. So that's that it could be applied for different types of landscapes around the world. So in order to achieve that, we identified 10 different value buckets, which are linked to the different returns: financial return, natural return, and social return. And let's say within those buckets, we aggregated different elements which could be linked to the different 10 elements. So from top to bottom, I'll start with the income, with the first one in financial return. And we say here higher income from farming, but it can also be, so it's farming and other practices that can be performed in the combined zone. So it can be also sustainably, let's say, sustainable fisheries. And it's important to note here that also the indirect returns, which will lead to improved financial return, are included here. So for example, improved soil quality, water, and biodiversity will lead to more, let's say, sustainable and stable and higher yields from farming. And those are all included in that first value bucket. And second one is income related to sustainable forest-related activities. So that can be sustainably, that can be sustainable forestry, for example. The third one is related to ecotourism. So just to explain a little bit on that, we looked at the value added of ecotourism related activities, but also new jobs and also additional spends by tourists in that area. The fourth one is a more general bucket for new economic activities. So what we also included here is some activities related to regenerative agriculture practices, but which are performed in the economic zone. So for example, when you switch to regenerative agriculture, you will also need to set up new businesses who are active in the trading and processing of these products. So those are included here, for example, but it can also be other new activities which, let's say, support the landscape restoration in a broader sense. The fifth one here is the increase in land value. And when it comes to natural return, we looked at the lower greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, lower carbon emissions and carbon sequestration, which is being done by either forestry, or let's say restoring a natural area, or by the switch to regenerative farming practices. And also at point 7, we looked at the improved balance in nitrogen and phosphate. So for example, nitrogen, also on the depositions through air and waterways. When it comes to social returns, of course, we looked at the value and cash flows related to jobs, but also increased safety. So what's included here, for example, is that we looked at the value of a lower chance of bushfires and flooding events, and on the health benefits, it's primarily we looked at the improved the value of the improved health conditions of local farmers when they use less pesticides. So this is a brief overview of the proceeds side, and it's good to mention here that the cost side are explained later on. So I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So just to give an example what this could look like for a landscape, this is the high-level outcome of applying this valuation method for our Spanish landscape, which Willem told about. So we did a case study on the Spanish landscape, but it only includes an intervention in about 8% of the total area. So we're planning to make a long-term landscape restoration plan for the whole area, and then let's say make a whole valuation assessment for the total area. But this is only a small part of it. Just to walk you briefly through it, on the left side, you see the present value of the required funding. So that's actually, let's say, the costs of the restoration activities, which are broken down in different elements. So it's it also is, let's say, the cost and funding necessary to restore the landscape per zone. And in the middle, we show the present values of the proceeds. So and the present value of the required funding is about 103 million, and the present value of the total proceeds is 204. And it's broken down in the different value buckets from farming to health. And also with the different colors, we show what type of returns those are. So financial, natural, or social. And you see the total on the right side, the 204. And when we subtract, let's say, the required funding from the proceeds, that leads to the total net value of the landscape restoration. And it's important to note here, perhaps, that the value is based on the difference between the case of restoration and business as usual. But maybe that speaks for itself. So I wanted to conclude here, let's say, what I wanted to say about our valuation approach. When you're interested to read more or to hear more about it, we'll share the links to the presentations and other materials later online. And when you can go to the next slide, please. I would like, so after speaking a bit about the barriers for mobilizing funding and also our valuation method and how we think that the valuation method can overcome some of these barriers, I would like to switch a little bit to a new subject, but related subject, and that's in the first place the investment case for landscape restoration and regenerative farming, and also the financing perspective that we have on it. So in this slide, I wanted to show something about how we look at the investment case for landscape restoration and, for example, region farming as a driver for landscape restoration. I have included an indicative picture here. So on the left axis, I have included risk-adjusted return, because I wanted to just let you know that it's important to look at the returns adjusted for risks. And there are two indicative lines here. So one for restoration, so that's the intervention case, and one for business as usual. And it's important to always look at the difference between those two. And how we look at it is that over time, the difference between the two will become larger and larger as and that's based off the drivers included below. So actually, when you speak in financial terms or jargon, landscape restoration will become more in the money over time. And that's because of some of the drivers below, because of the loss of biodiversity, soil and water will, let's say, continue. So will increase over time. Also the climate change impacts, and as a result of that, loss of economic activity. And last but not least, what we foresee is that the policy development, so for example, including subsidies and taxes, will be developed more towards sustainable practices. So all these elements will lead to a larger gap between restoration and business as usual. And yeah, of course, we don't know, and every landscape is different. So it's not necessarily so that restoration will always increase, let's say, the returns or the risk-adjusted return, but at least it will, at a minimum, lead to a lower, slower decline of the return. So there will always be a gap, and over time, that gap will increase. That's our view.
Jasper, maybe just a brief, quick, because we still have 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Or we have 15 minutes, but it would be nice to also have some space for questions and answers.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'll speed up a little bit. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just some of the developments that we foresee. So also that, actually the investments in landscape restoration will become the new asset class for financial institutions. And some of the drivers are included below. And these will become the new infrastructure investments. And one of the things that we also foresee that there will be developed large blended finance vehicles. And in the next slides, I'll show a dummy outline as a start of the discussion that we would like to have. So this is just a high-level outline what this could look like, with a bit of information on scale. So it will be large scale. It can include one landscape or several landscapes, and include different activities related to landscape restoration, and it will possibly be blended finance and including the different parties included below. And with that, I would like to conclude and hand over to Willem, because based on this picture, we would like to start a brief discussion with you on some of the elements related to these large vehicles that we foresee that will be developed in the near future.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much, Jasper Bertels. Maybe it's good to know that Jasper has a financial background. He's been working for the Central Netherlands Bank, as well as for commercial banks like ING. And he developed a clear understanding of how landscapes are working and how to create a narrative and a language that is important for the finance industry to understand what's happening on the ground. And that is his work field together with another colleague, Alejandro Diaz, who is based in Canada and Montreal. And the idea is indeed, as you explained, Jasper, is by building that narrative, that language bridge towards the finance industry, to bring them on board in these kind of large blended finance vehicles that you have just described. And based on the track record we have done over the last 9 years in the landscapes, we now have something to explain. We understand that this 4 tranche framework is working. Farmers understand it, local governments understand it, conservationists find their place. The next thing is how to get access to these these finance vehicles or to the finance industry to help us to basically to accelerate the restoration industry and to create this next step. So yeah, maybe there are questions, Jasper, and I'm looking here in the room. Maybe there are questions of people who have a question. Yeah, maybe I think you need to go to the mic. Yeah. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, is there also room just for questions? Because I just had a general question, not about this.
I think, yeah, if it's not going about, if it has something to do with biodiversity and ecosystems, that would be fine.
Okay,
yeah?
Great.
And maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Jeffrey Brandt, and I have a question because of the work that I do for Trésor Foundation. We work in French Guiana on the conservation of tropical forests. And you mentioned these three zones in the start of your presentation. So the natural zone, the economic zone, and the combined zone. And I was wondering if you could reflect on the situation that we're working on, because this Trésor Reserve that we're trying to preserve is in the Caux Mountains. And there's a strong desire there from local people to have some socioeconomic development. They are increasingly upset with the unemployment rates. And given your experience in sustainable landscape, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on a situation like this? It's quite an intact forest landscape. It's a huge biodiversity hotspot, but there are more and more pressures on the ecosystem, on the biodiversity with regards to the socioeconomic developments.
Okay, shall I take this one, Jasper?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, so this is mostly of French Guiana is still, you could say, a natural zone. I mean, the business cases for tropical rainforest, because that you are referring to, are of course about what we all know, the payment for ecosystem services stuff. So carbon, water, biodiversity, tourism. You know, those are that's a suite where you can choose out. So and non-timber forest products. So when we look towards rainforest, the biggest opportunity of degraded rainforest is agroforestry. Large agroforestry systems, so that's a diversity of cropping systems, you name it, mango, papaya, and a lot of indigenous tropical fruits that you can plant, and that you can rebuild a kind of a shrub system based on the original tropical layers that a tropical forest has. Of course, the next step is you need to make corridors in those places. And that is an opportunity. If it is a rainforest that is untouched, then it is, of course, a task of a government to help with carbon offset and RED projects and these kind of things. But this is more difficult. RED, or carbon offsetting and getting funding out of the carbon industry. We are working on a landscape carbon vehicle based on Verra and Gold Standard as a co-benefit layer. So this is, I think, the next step that you need to work on in the Guianas. Get carbon on board, make sure that the polluters pay for the rest of the conservation of the forest. Yeah, other questions? Are there maybe financial experts in the room or other experts who would like to question anything or general questions? If not, then you might have a question, Jasper.
No,
so maybe, yeah, please, Jasper.
Yeah, and do we have time to go to one of the discussion points?
Yeah, maybe you can put it up. Next slide. I think.
Yeah, the next one. Yeah,
please, maybe. Yeah.
A general question, actually, about those large-scale vehicles that we foresee that will be developed in the near future. We don't have all the knowledge ourselves, and it needs to be, let's say, developed with different parties around those landscapes. So we also want to hear from you what your thoughts are. What would be the most suitable or successful model? So a finance vehicle based on at a landscape level. So for one total landscape, for example, including all the different activities that we talked about, or at a portfolio level, so including different landscapes and more maybe diversification also in regions and activities, etc. Yes, so I don't know if there's anyone who has thoughts about it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, the first thing that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about the scale was based on the actual scale of people. You know, you want to try to integrate systems with case studies that probably are based on a single person, based on a family scale, and then maybe on a village scale. So I would think the size of the society that you're trying to interact with is very critical in terms of making it tangible to the local people. And then I had a quick aside question too. Do you provide economic case studies that have production examples with real economic numbers in your study? And that could be a yes or no response. Thank you.
Yes, will you go first?
Yes, so if I understand you correctly, so yeah, for Spain, for example, in the case study, we have looked, of course, at the different agricultural business cases. So also in case of restoration, so that's region ag, and also in business as usual, and at the difference, with all the different data and also forecasts of the different data needed there. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. And it's also included in the documents we have online, if you wanted to have a look.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. An applause, please, for the presenters of this wonderful new model. Maybe just before we close, Willem, with all your experience and having these 4 returns, which of the 4 would you say at this moment is most undervalued in its potential to contribute to saving biodiversity?
Now that's quite easy. That is the return of inspiration. I think what we as a conservation community are very good in sending out the red list message. You know, it's going bad, it's going even better than bad, and it's going very bad. That doesn't incentivize people to action. So what we did is we really turned that around. You know, having been worked in the, you could say, the red list world for many, many years, I know now that if you say it's going bad with species, for normal people, yeah, they feel like hopeless. For experts, you know, they can try to save a frog or whatever, but for those people, it's very difficult. And I think bringing back hope and optimism, and by the way, this framework also will help to halt polarization of communities, because we're talking about rural and urban communities. And just for one example, and to show why this return of inspiration is so important, the people we work with in Australia, rural farmers, or in South Africa, or in Spain, are great people. But if you look how they vote and whether they love Trump, I can assure you they love these kind of people, because those people speak that language. And we are able to bring, without talking politics, bring them together in a landscape and inspire them. Not only they inspire themselves with this, first of all, with this framework, because we start talking about 2 things. What is your dream for the coming 20, 30 years for yourself in this landscape? That is the first question we ask to all those people. And then they have dreams, they come up with actions, they come up with so many ideas, and we can frame that in this storyline and help them to do something. And then biodiversity will come, because everyone loves nature. I mean, that is a no-brainer.
Thank you so much, Willem, for these final words. Thank you, Jasper. Thanks very much, Willem. Thank you all on the live stream. Thank you here for being with us today. And with this, we close the session. Thank you.